Unit 3 of the first module revisits the journey from disaster management to disaster risk management. Until recent times, disasters were largely understood as sudden events. The widely accepted way of dealing with disasters was emergency response or reaction after an event. Disaster mitigation solutions were predominantly of technical and engineering nature. By the 1980s, there was a sharp increasing trend worldwide with numbers of disasters escalating from natural hazards and resulting loss of lives and damages to property. The financial and economic costs of disaster response were posing tremendous challenges to the national governments and international community. Continuous research and academic work provide explanations to social and economic aspects contributory for hazards to becoming disasters. Now, it is widely accepted that disasters are not natural, that disasters are outcomes of natural hazards coming to affect properties and people who are exposed to hazard risk and therefore vulnerable. Let us make a closer examination of how hazards turn into disasters. A hazard can be excessive rainfall, an earthquake, landslide, or a long dry spell. As this figure depicts, an unbalanced rock on a hillock is a potential hazard. What is depicted here is visualization of what is vulnerability to a potential hazard. When there are people and assets in close proximity to a potential hazard, they are exposed to risk and therefore vulnerable to that hazard. They may or may not be aware of the hazard. If they are not aware of the potential hazard, they are at high risk. Even if they are aware, but have not taken actions to reduce the risk, such as through a warning system and installing physical barriers to reinforce the rock, the levels of risk and vulnerability remains high. Disaster is the implication of the combination of a potential hazard with vulnerable people, physical, economic, and environmental assets. While this set of diagrams is a simplistic impression of hazard, vulnerability, and disaster for the purpose of understanding the terms and their interrelationships, hazards, risks, exposure to risk, vulnerabilities, and disasters need to be explored, taking into account a range of dynamic factors and processes. Additional references suggested for this module provide further information on understanding disasters.
Unpacking of what constitutes a disaster as shown here provide the basis for understanding the main components leading to a disaster, damages and losses of a disaster can cause. Hazards, exposure to risk from a potential hazard, and vulnerability to a potential hazard are the key components of a disaster. Vulnerability is complex. It needs to be analyzed and explored from social and economic angles, in addition to physical, geographical, and environmental aspects. With this understanding, it was concluded that disasters are not natural. Disasters are a combination of natural and human-made elements. With this analysis, several important conclusions were drawn. 1. Hazards may not be prevented. However, information and understanding of hazards can help to identify measures for reducing exposure and better preparedness. 2. It is evident that disasters could be prevented and/or mitigated. Potential impacts can be reduced by working on the causes of disaster risk, exposure, and vulnerability to hazards. 3. Hazards and disaster risk do not stay at the same level. Hazard profiles, intensities, frequency of occurrence in any given location changes over time due to a host of factors such as patterns of habitat, economic development approaches, human interaction with the environment, and environmental resources. 4. Disaster risk management, therefore, is an integral part of economic and social development. By the decade of the 1990s, there was a felt need to rethink how disasters were addressed. To this effect, the decade of 1990 was declared by the United Nations as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, IDNDR. The IDNDR brought about a paradigm shift in moving from reacting to disasters after an event to acting on disaster preparedness. At the end of the IDNDR, the United Nations General Assembly recognized the need for a common international framework to the challenge in front of the international community by increasing incidence and scale of disasters. It established the International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, ISDR, in 1999 to enable nations and communities in becoming resilient to the effects of natural, technological, and environmental hazards. Additionally, by integrating risk prevention strategies into sustainable development activities, It facilitated governments and stakeholders to take action on global frameworks agreed upon. The combined learning by the end of the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction is captured in this framework. The IDNDR clarified disasters are not natural, therefore the term natural disasters is not used anymore. A more appropriate term is a disaster caused by a natural hazard. The Hyogo framework for action, its 5 priorities for action, are founded on this framework. The sustainable development context defined by the economic, social, cultural, ecosystem, and environmental considerations in the outer circle provides the context of risk and vulnerability. Factors of exposure to risk and vulnerability are a result of economic, social, cultural, ecosystem, and environmental considerations. The need to focus on disaster risk reduction is shown in the inner circle. The 5 priorities for action for disaster risk reduction accordingly are: making disaster risk a national and local priority, risk identification and understanding disaster risk, developing knowledge and information for disaster risk reduction, applying disaster risk reduction measures to address underlying factors of risk and of reducing vulnerability, and taking measures to strengthen preparedness and response. HFA was adopted as a global reference framework for disaster risk reduction at the World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, representing a landmark and worldwide commitment by 168 states to implementing a disaster reduction agenda. HFA lists down 5 priorities for action. At the end of the HFA period, building on learning of the decade, Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030 was endorsed by the United Nations General Assembly as the blueprint for reducing disaster risk by building resilience. Sendai Framework reiterates the inherent interlinkages between hazard risk and development. The Sendai Framework is a 15-year, voluntary, non-binding agreement which recognizes that the state has the primary role to reduce disaster risk, but that responsibilities are to be shared with the other stakeholders, including local government and the private sector. It aims to achieve the outcome: substantial reduction of disaster risk and losses in lives, livelihoods, and health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental assets of persons, businesses, communities, and countries. Its 4 priorities for action are founded on preventing the creation of new disaster risks, reducing existing disaster risk, and building resilience to disasters by adopting a disaster risk-informed development approaches. We hope you have enjoyed the video on understanding disasters and hope to see you soon.